concept assembly line, where ideas get to work.
For decades, central banks have played the starring role in economic stabilization. When growth slows or recession looms, we look to monetary authorities to pull the lever, cut interest rates, pump liquidity, and buy up bonds. The assumption is simple: make money cheaper, and people will borrow, invest, and spend. Demand will rise, growth will return. But what if the spark doesn't catch? What if the fire doesn't burn? That's the limitation of monetary policy. It can create the conditions for growth, but not the growth itself. It can ease the cost of borrowing, but it can't force anyone to borrow. It can flood the banking system with reserves, but it can't conjure up external demand for goods, services, or labor. In short, monetary policy can stimulate, but only if the rest of the economy is already primed to respond. This is where fiscal policy, public spending, proves not only superior, but essential. Central banks influence the economy through interest rates and balance sheet operations. Lower interest rates make loans cheaper, encourage investment, and reduce debt burdens. Quantitative easing injects liquidity by purchasing government securities, increasing the reserves banks hold. But these tools are indirect. They rely on market participants to take action. In theory, a lower mortgage rate should lead to a home purchase. A cheaper business loan should lead to a new factory. But what if consumers are tapped out, worried about job loss, or already buried under student debt? What if businesses face too little customer demand to justify expansion? The cost of money may drop, but the appetite for debt doesn't always follow. That's the central flaw in the idea of monetary stimulus as the primary growth engine. It presumes a demand that may not exist. Monetary policy is like holding a rope tied to the economy. It works best when you need to pull things back, to slow overheating, cool inflation, or rein in financial excess. Raise interest rates, tighten credit, reduce leverage. That's the tug, the tension, pulling the economy back from the edge. But when the economy stalls, you can't push a rope. You can loosen it, lower interest rates, flood the system with reserves, ease financial conditions. But that only creates slack. It doesn't move the economy forward on its own. The rope goes limp unless someone or something on the other end takes the initiative. Fiscal policy doesn't rely on the rope. It pushes directly. It builds schools, funds infrastructure, pays nurses, renovates housing, launches clean energy projects. It doesn't wait for someone to tug, it acts. But for that push to be effective, the rope can't be taut. It needs slack. It needs room to move without being yanked backward by tight monetary conditions. In this light, monetary policy isn't the driver of growth, it's the stabilizer. It can tighten the rope in times of excess, and it can loosen the rope in times of need, allowing fiscal policy to do the heavy lifting. Where monetary policy is passive and reactive, fiscal policy is active and generative. It doesn't wait for the private sector to borrow, it spends directly. It funds public works, infrastructure, research, healthcare, education, housing. It pays people to do things the market has neglected. And in doing so, it puts money directly into the hands of households and firms, where it circulates and multiplies. Fiscal policy doesn't just stimulate demand, it is demand. It hires, it buys, it invests. And when done at scale, it catalyzes the very private sector responses that monetary policy struggles to awaken. Consider the difference between lowering interest rates and hiring construction workers to build schools. One hopes someone might take advantage of the opportunity. The other creates the opportunity directly and pays for the labor, materials, and services that ripple across the economy. During the post-2008 recovery, the Federal Reserve pushed rates to near zero and deployed trillions in asset purchases. And yet the recovery was sluggish and uneven. Why? Because the real bottleneck wasn't the cost of credit. It was the lack of investment in people and places left behind. In the absence of robust fiscal policy, monetary stimulus functions like priming a pump with no water source. The mechanism is sound, but the substance is missing. A central bank can encourage risk-taking, but it can't build affordable housing. It can inflate asset prices, but it can't provide childcare. It can lower borrowing costs, but it can't invent new industries or revitalize a crumbling power grid. This is why interest rate cuts often help Wall Street before Main Street. The financial system responds instantly. But households and small businesses, especially in distressed communities, are the last to benefit, and sometimes never do. For the Trump administration, tariffs have emerged as a tool of industrial revival. a kind of brute force attempt to bring manufacturing home by making foreign alternatives more expensive. In theory, raising import costs should encourage domestic production, reindustrialize hollowed-out regions, and create jobs in sectors once offshored to lower-cost economies. But there's a problem. Tariffs raise prices before they raise output. They make inputs more expensive before domestic capacity is rebuilt. The inflationary shock arrives up front, while the benefits lag behind. This has real macroeconomic consequences. The inflationary impact of tariffs tightens household budgets. It raises costs for businesses, especially small manufacturers and retailers dependent on global supply chains. And perhaps most critically, it ties the hands of the Federal Reserve. Rising prices, even if caused by tariffs and not excessive demand, look inflationary on paper. That limits the Fed's ability to lower rates, because doing so risks being seen as capitulating to inflation. In essence, tariffs impose a kind of double bind. They slow demand while attempting to stimulate supply. But without complementary fiscal investment to offset the cost and kickstart new industries, they can end up stalling both. What happens next is predictable. The hoped-for reshoring wave fizzles. New factories aren't built. Jobs aren't created. The rope remains slack, but no one is pushing. This is the missing link in most reshoring rhetoric: demand. You can't build a domestic supply chain in a vacuum. You need customers. You need throughput. You need working-class households with disposable income, public institutions with procurement budgets, and infrastructure projects that rely on domestic goods. And these budgets need to have capacity to consume higher-priced goods driven up by tariff cost inflation. Tariffs by themselves don't provide any of that. They only shift the price signal. They don't build the factory, train the workers, or guarantee the purchase orders that make reshoring financially viable. And when the inflationary effects of tariffs lead to higher interest rates or a paused monetary response, the cost of investment rises just as demand is being throttled. You end up with higher prices, tighter credit, and no new jobs. In this context, the only thing that can close the loop, the only thing that can align supply-side industrial goals with actual macroeconomic growth, is targeted fiscal policy. Not just spending for spending's sake, but strategic investment, subsidies for domestic producers, public procurement for critical sectors, and cash into the hands of those most likely to spend it. Ultimately, jobs don't materialize because we cut taxes or put up trade barriers. They materialize because someone, somewhere, needs a product or service and is willing to pay for it. That's demand. And demand can't be willed into existence through ideology or wishful thinking. It must be cultivated. It must be built. It must be financed. This is where GOP economic policy often misfires. They pursue growth from the top down, cutting taxes for the wealthy, raising tariffs to coerce investment, and hoping the private sector fills in the blanks. But these approaches erode demand from below. They tighten family budgets. They sap the energy of small businesses. They make it harder, not easier, for the economy to self-generate the very growth we claim to want. In a high-interest rate environment, monetary policy is already constrained. And when fiscal policy is used to subsidize capital rather than people, we lose the most powerful growth engine we have, a population with the confidence and cash to spend. So now we see that fiscal policy can fall short if it's poorly aimed. And in recent decades, we've seen too many examples of fiscal firepower pointed the wrong way, toward the top of the income ladder. When tax cuts are skewed toward high earners, the stimulative impact is blunted. High-income households are more likely to save than spend their windfalls. Their basic needs are already met. Their consumption levels are already stable. So when they receive tax breaks, much of that money sits idle, in financial assets, offshore accounts, or passed through to corporate buybacks, not in the real economy where growth is needed. Meanwhile, to pay for those tax breaks, politicians often slash spending elsewhere: safety nets, healthcare, education, infrastructure. But those cuts hit the bottom and middle of the income distribution, the very groups most likely to spend every dollar they receive. The result? A fiscal policy that subtracts more demand than it adds. This isn't just inequitable, it's self-defeating. Tax cuts for the top are not inherently bad, but they need to be paired with sufficient spending to support the base of our economy, in the working and middle classes. These are the real pay-fors. Because too many in Congress misunderstand the functional mechanics of fiat currency creation, In sovereign nations with their own currency, they mistakenly think of budgeting as a zero-sum exercise. But the national debt doesn't get paid back the way a maxed-out credit card does for a private household. We have unlimited money creation capacity, but are limited by production capacity. We need to maximize employment and industrial investment to grow our productive capacity to pay for tax cuts. Failure to do that invites inflationary pressures that erode the intended tax savings. Every dollar of fiscal spending has a multiplier, the amount of economic activity it generates. Investments in low-income communities, infrastructure, and direct job creation tend to have the highest multipliers. Corporate tax breaks and upper-income tax cuts, among the lowest. So if the goal is to actually stimulate growth, the direction of the spending matters as much as the amount. Austerity at the base to fund indulgence at the top not only starves the real economy, it builds political resentment, weakens long-term capacity, and locks us into cycles of false scarcity. When we talk about living within our means, we should ask, whose means are we measuring? A government that issues its own currency can afford to invest in people. The real constraint isn't the money, it's the real resources: labor, materials, energy, and time. And when those are idle, when people are unemployed or underused, it is not responsible to withhold spending. It is reckless. So we return to the central truth. If you want to create jobs, you need to create customers. If you want to build factories, you need to buy what they'll make. If you want to bring industries home, you need to lay the groundwork: labor training, infrastructure, public procurement, and income support. Fiscal policy is not just about money. It's about design. It's economic architecture. Done right, it doesn't merely inject cash. It builds capacity, creates markets, and launches a feedback loop between employment and demand. Monetary policy can pull back the economy when it overheats. It can loosen the rope to allow fiscal forces to push forward. But it cannot generate momentum alone, especially when fiscal choices undermine the very demand it's trying to support. That's why we must stop thinking of fiscal spending as a reactive measure of last resort. It is the engine, the strategy, the work. And when we use it deliberately, when we aim it low enough to lift people up, we don't just stimulate growth, we build it. We need to stop treating fiscal policy like a blunt instrument. It is not just about how much we spend, but where we spend and who benefits. An economy can be flooded with liquidity from the top and still die of thirst at the bottom. If monetary policy is the spark, fiscal policy must be the firewood, and it needs to be stacked where it will catch. And if stimulating growth is like managing a rope tied to the economy, we need to use it wisely. Monetary policy pulls back in times of overheating. It offers slack when stimulus is needed. But it's fiscal policy, the push, that gets things moving forward. Because if we're serious about building a resilient, inclusive, and dynamic economy, we need more than financial lubrication. We need real investment, real employment, real demand. And that means knowing when to pull and when to push. This video is part of a broader project to reimagine public policy for real people, grounded in modern monetary theory, committed to abundance over austerity, and focused on rebuilding the freedom infrastructure of everyday life. If my work resonates with you, share it. Subscribe on YouTube for more multi-format content. Together, we can reclaim what was once built and build it back better.